Hello, welcome to the Language and Power podcast. We are here today with Dr. Michael Kranert from University of Southampton. Hi, how are you doing, Michael?
Yeah, not too bad.
Tom's here.
Hi, both.
Tom's here as usual. Hi, Tom.
Hi, the Michaels.
Yes, so we're talking today about an article that you've published, Michael, in Critical Discourse Studies, the wickedness of net zero policy. So we both thought this was a really interesting article, and it's on our kind of favourite topic of sustainability around that. So we thought we'd have a chat with you and ask you about what you found, how you did it, and so on. So, yeah, the article, I mean, just to summarise it, tell me if I'm wrong, tell me if I need to add anything important here, but you examine international climate change policy and how they're adapted at the local level, so local government level, and using a case study from a council debate in Germany about the EU programme 100 climate neutral and smart cities by 2030. I love the way that policies are trip off the tongue. And your analysis focuses on the role of scales in policy discourse, so I'm sure we'll be asking you about that, and highlights the complexity and wickedness of climate change as a policy problem. Again, something that we'll probably come back and ask you about in a bit more detail. And your study contributes to an area called critical policy discourse analysis. And you talk about something that I know that Tom's interested in, epistemological and ontological scales.
Love them.
In connecting global and local policy discourses. So, yeah, there's loads there to get into. Risk of starting this off by making it feel like you're back in your PhD viva.
So tell us, Michael, why did you undertake this research?
That's always the starting point was actually a completely different one. I wrote a module together with a colleague about language power and institutions and how that works. And we started reading around. We're both interested in political discourse. And what we all tend to do when we analyze political discourse, we look at national discourses because it's so easy to access. You have the recordings, you have the speeches, you have newspapers. My colleague Darren Puffy, who's now a member of Parliament, was at the time a councillor, and I've got another friend in Halle, where the case study is, who is a local council. And we both looked at each other and thought, has actually anyone looked at the language of local councils? How policy is made there, how politics works there. We started searching, we couldn't find much. And at the same time, I started conversations with people about this, saying, I'm interested in that. And how do you get to an article like this is sometimes a tiny bit of luck. Because what happened is that a friend in Halle, Henrik Lange, who was the council leader for a bit, said, I've got a case study for you. We've just tried to apply for this EU program, and guess what? It all went pear-shaped. Because no one understood quite what this was about, and there were so many actors involved. Do you want to have a look at this? And by the way, and that was the other lucky bit, we have data on this because it was during COVID, and the councils and the committee stages were recorded on YouTube, publicly available. I mean, what better for a researcher, right? Not having to actually produce the data, but it's there. So that's how this all started. So nothing with complexity and scales to start with. It came literally from an interest in how local politics works, how climate change as a complex issue works between local politics and national and international politics. Yeah. So that's the origin of it.
Yeah. And again, at risk of making this sound like a PhD viva, what did you find? What did you? I mean, I guess for those people who are listening that aren't academics, the way that haven't been around academics, which we write these articles that get published in peer-reviewed journals, which this has been, but we've got they make the thing about these academic articles is that they make an original contribution to knowledge in some way, So what did you do with this article? You're interested in this particular case, and I think we'll go into that again in a bit.
So what I was interested is how policy travels. So this EU policy, you probably, if you're an academic, you must have heard of the Horizon program, but Horizon is much broader than just research funding. So there's a project in there to make the cities climate neutral in Europe, and they tried to have 100 cities that apply for funding to get some consultancy done. There's actually not much substantial funding. It's really about consultancy to make these cities climate neutral by 2030, so way earlier than that is actually promised for the international, which is 2050 for the European Union, or 2045, which is for Germany. And this paper was published in October 21. And actually, the local council in this case didn't even notice it. It hadn't noticed it if there wasn't an NGO who went to them and said, "Look, here's something we can do, and here's for us is we want you to pledge that you're climate neutral by 2030." And that started a whole layer of debate in the council. Should you apply? Can we actually be climate neutral by 2030? What would that involve? What do we know about this? And obviously there was a political clash as well. So what happened is you have this very simple, funding text, and that makes a proposal, and you would think that is then somehow implemented. And the idea in policy literature is always, well, once policy is written, it somehow reduces complexity. And what tends to happen is if it travels between one side and another, if it travels between one level and another, it gets opened up again. Because, the council needs to make the decision to apply. It needs to make decisions around that. So all the assumptions that are in that text of the policy are reopened. And that's where it becomes interesting. Because you can then see loads of things that are happening, on the one hand, on the climate discourse itself. And that happens in the understanding of this policy text. And that's where the scales idea came in. So that's how I got to the scales idea. I read around a bit, and I found Tom's article on scales, and I've read other people's work on scales, and I saw, okay, so there's two things happening here. One is these politicians are constantly bickering about whose responsibility it is to reduce climate change and to reduce our impact on the climate. Is it the local council? Can the local council actually do anything? Is it local government? Is it sort of state government? Germany has a federal system. Is it the national government? Is it the EU? Is it international relations? What is it? So that's one set of scales. So they're constantly actually debating about which area of influence they have, whose responsibility it should be, and which timeframes are happening there as well. So one of the things that the politicians picked up is, well, why on earth is Germany saying 2045? Now you're asking us to do 2030. The European Union is doing 2050, and the Chinese, by the way, are doing 2060. Why on earth should we do something? And that's the bit.
So this is reaching net zero by these dates.
By these dates, that's exactly right. And so that is the bit that the literature on scales calls epistemological scales. So the actors who debate policy or debate anything name on which level things are happening, in which temporal and local spaces things are happening, and which problems they have with that, and which responsibilities they attach to it, and how they talk about it is also very interesting, right? So that's that end of scales. So I do the other one as well.
Well. Let me just sort of. I know because Tom knows about this as well, but let me just sort of get it clear. In this, you're talking about geographical scales, but also those the institutions that are mapped onto those geographical scales. So Europe mapped onto the EU and its apparatus, various institutions and so on. And then you've got the Germany as a nation state, and then the apparatus that goes around that, the German national government, and then in Germany's case, you've got federal scale locations, which are regions and so on. Yeah. Okay.
And I didn't make this up. These are the categories that the discourse actors are using.
So this is so epistemological scales, then they correspond to the level of responsibility for carrying out action, yeah? And then people are arguing about whose responsibility is and who has the potential to do this. Is that? But then you bring in also ontological scales, which can you tell us then what the difference is between ontological scales, how they're different from epistemological scales, or what they are at all?
So the epistemological side of things is pretty much agreed on also with geographers. They talk about this and they say, yes, we can see this in discourse. It's happening. Is basically the interesting thing for geographers and social scientists was always, oh, this is discursively constructed. This is not fixed. We are not having these states and these regions. They are actually they are debating who is responsible. What do they look like? What do we attach? What meanings do we attach to them? Now, the ontological side of things is that there are somehow levels or scales, time spaces that make a difference in meaning making and in effects that we have when we do policy and when we change things. And the geographers are saying, this is making things too complicated. We shouldn't really do this. The epistemological side is easy because we can see it. The ontological side is a bit murky and we can't see it. Well, actually, we can, because what we know as linguists is that if meaning of text travels from one environment to another, it's never fixed in its meaning. It changes its meaning, and that happens both on the understanding of the terms, but also on the assumptions that are made when policy is initiated. And these things, what we call orders of discourse, they can be described as ontological scales. And what is happening in this case is basically that things that the European Union policy writers thought are straightforward weren't as straightforward. So one assumption was, it's no problem to publish this call for applications for funding in October and have a deadline in January. They had no understanding of how German councils work. So it was actually an impossibility for the German council to make a decision, to reach a policy decision in that timescale.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just kind of take it back again. So you've got the European Union putting out a kind of pot of money, saying, "Look, we've got this money. We want you to spend it, and this is how we want people to spend it." But you apply for it. That's what happened. That's the what was it called? The 100 cities.
100
tell
climate
us a bit
neutral
about
cities.
climate neutral cities. 100 climate neutral smart cities by 2030. That's what that is. It's a bit of money and some criteria by which people might have to apply for it. And then local councils or city councils are across the European Union are invited to apply for this funding and meet this criteria. Yeah, okay, got it.
And for that, they would have to promise something. They would have to promise we are climate neutral by 2030. They need to make a public pledge. And here comes the crux. The European Union had the ingenious idea to call this a climate city contract.
Yes,
and when you look in how they describe it, they say, "Oh, but we don't mean contract. What we mean is a public pledge, and it's not legally binding. We know that, and don't worry about it. It's just a public statement that you are pledging to be climate neutral." And that's that. And they thought with that, what we call meta discursive element there, sort of saying that's what it is. That problem is solved. It wasn't solved at all. There was a huge local debate to say, hang on, this is a contract. Can we actually promise this? Are we making ourselves liable? Are we causing any issues? So all these things were brought up again and were opened up. And that's exactly what I mean by ontological scale. They couldn't foresee how local people interpret what is in the text. So that's another element of the discursive order that's happening here, that nothing is actually set in stone until you have the debate.
Going back to your title, then, this idea of wicked problems, in the fact that they're never simple. And so maybe, the EEC document tried to make this a simple problem. Of course, it's a wicked problem for the reasons you're talking about, the difference between the ontological scales and the epistemological scales. And I think one of the things I found really interesting, because it's something we have to think about with this whole idea of policy making for environmental change, the urgency of it, but also the need to be practical, which is a very difficult compromise. And I think you're saying by using this word contract, even though they said asterisk, by the way, we do not mean contract. When we say contract, we mean something in our own language, which the European Union is quite good at doing. That at the ontological scale, at the real world scale, the way people mix with each other on a day-to-day basis, one of the companies you were talking about, I think it was a state-owned energy company, was worried that people would be able to argue in court that this actually was legally binding despite the asterisk from the European Union, and that therefore signing up for this would affect some of their decision making and the deals they could make with other people in order to make the initial date of 2045. That might actually become less achievable because they weren't able to carry out the plans that they already had envisaged by signing up for this earlier date, which was then going to put the kibosh on some of their deals. So we get this huge idea, let's impose something that's even more green, but it's in danger of actually getting rid of the earlier infrastructure for the less green but achievable goal.
Although that's yet another element. So the contract side of things was not only brought in by the city-owned energy provider, but also by the city themselves and by the lawyers. The businesses had yet another problem with it. Is that they were working under the assumption 2045, and with the assumption 2045 made certain investments that they need to make. So it was very interesting to talk to this CEO who is very sort of subscribed to the green agenda. He said, I want to do this. I am a CEO of a publicly owned business for a reason. I'm doing something for the people here. We need to do long-term planning. But if I say 2030 is okay, I get into trouble with my investments that I need to drive the green agenda because I don't get any government money. I need to make my money on the open market. So there are unintended consequences here. And that was a really interesting thing, because there's yet another thing that happened is, so they said no. The whole thing was pushed back into committee, and by that time it was January and the application deadline was passed. And that could have been the end of it, but it wasn't. First of all, this city energy provider group was getting a bit of a bad conscience in a way. They felt like, oh, we stopped something that we actually for. So he literally said to me, I slept on this over Christmas, and I thought, we can't just be against something. We need to do something to effect positive change. What is it we can do? What do we actually have in-house? And he realized that one of the things about this EU program that annoyed him was they wanted to bring in external expertise. And he said, well, actually, I've got this expertise in-house. We have someone working on climate change, on carbon budgeting and all of that. Why are we not doing this ourselves? So they started the whole process of what should have happened under that EU umbrella themselves, and said and made an offer to the city council and said, guys, we know how to do this. We should do something about this, and initiated this whole it's called Roadmap 2045. Literally, they used the English term roadmap, and produced a full set of not only a brochure but also an accountancy system, spreadsheets, a presentation that they went round with 2 different businesses and stuff. So the whole thing started, and it wouldn't have started if it wasn't for that EU policy. You see, so was a positive effect of this as well. There's no unintended consequence. Do you think you can just drop a policy and you can control what the end outcome is? That is an impossibility, and it has all to do with the way discourse works, and that's where this wickedness came in for me. That if you read the wickedness literature, it's actually all about technology and about policy, about a problem that you can't describe easily, therefore you can't offer a solution. These are what's called the wicked problems. But what none of these wickedness scholars have talked about is that the communication and the negotiation of policy itself is also uncontrollable, is also a complexity problem. And that's what I tried to get at the title and in my analysis.
One lovely, I think, coming out of that, sorry, just struck me there as you were saying that, these problems are seen as wicked if you're coming from a perspective that wants things to be simple. But for what you're saying is actually when these simple documents, as you say, it was dropped in and it created these repercussions. But actually, those repercussions, you can describe them as wicked because they were complex. But this is the way discourse really works. This is real life. So actually, it's not a wicked problem, because it's only a wicked problem if you want a simple solution, because that's impossible, and that's why it's a wicked problem. But if you don't want a simple solution, if you're actually happy to run with a complex solution that is ever changing and dynamic, that's fine. It's only if you don't accept that as a possible solution that it's a problem. And it always points to this idea that things are solved in a complex way, and we've just got to. We can't control it totally. We just got to keep a handle on it and not try and force it, like you were saying. It's what I'm getting the more I think about your article and what you're saying to us now, which is really quite fascinating.
No, that is true. But on the other hand, you have what Michael said at the beginning, right? We've got a quite an urgent problem
Yes.
that we need to solve, and that needs collaboration. And I mean, this is actually how I originally stumbled across this wickedness term. Again, research is another thing that is actually not linear and not controlled very easily. I didn't come with this wickedness agenda to the problem. I read around and stumbled across this Pollitt quote that I bring right at the beginning, right? Government policy making needs to be joined up across sectors in climate change. And it's a big ask, given that we're not very good at this. And that is the problem that makes climate change so complicated. That it's not something you can only do at the local level, but it's also not something that you can only do at the international level. And you could also see that in the political discourse side of things itself, because people were opposed to each other. It was just about that. Some people were saying it's complete nonsense that we're discussing this. This is a waste of time. Local council cannot deal with climate change. This is something we can only do internationally. And that's, of course, not true, because a lot of things need to be done locally. I mean, behavior change is nothing you can legislate in a Paris Accord, but that won't do anything.
And is there something particular in German cities where I don't think we've quite described that the energy companies are much more local than they might be in the UK, for example, and associated with city governments and so on. Is that am I getting that right?
Yeah, that I mean that was that's where the involvement came from. So this city energy provider is actually a bigger conglomerate that also does transport and waste and all of that. And that is city controlled, and the local councillors sitting on the board for these things. So they are constantly having conversations, and but they're also sometimes talking across. I mean, that's just the other interesting bit, this sort of translational exercise between business and politics, right? There's this CEO needing to explain to politicians, hang on a minute. If you want this agenda, but at the same time you have no money for me, then I need to do this according to the laws of the market. And the laws of the market are such that if you tell me I have to do 2030 in all sectors, and that was what the EU policy asked for. He said, I know a lot of sectors where I can easily do it, and I can do it by tomorrow if you let me. But there are other sectors where I cannot do it by 2030 without doing damage to the sectors that I could do tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so there are other things. And he said that if the EU program given us any money, capital to do things, I would have gone for it. But as they're only wanting to give us expertise from the outside, but no money to solve the actual problem, I have to give the money myself.
But also the expertise was from the outside, and so therefore wasn't aware of the niceties, and so that actually was probably useless anyway. When they realised that they had their own expertise that was more locally scaled, that was a positive outcome. Yeah,
That's quite a common issue, isn't it? Because policies that or things that are asked to be done from a national scale to a local scale. But let me just clarify, because I think I've got this wrong from what you just said. There wasn't this EU scheme wasn't giving any money to the local places, right? So I got that wrong at the beginning.
There was a bit of money. There was a bit of money attached to it, but this money was sort of set aside for consultancy, for helping the local government to do the right strategies, but it was not investment money. There was no investment money to sort of say, let's change the way we produce energy, or let's change the way
So-
we. It was simply
So
policy
why
money.
why did they do that? Why? Just thinking about if the EU wants right. So the EU has a kind of set time. The EU will be. Is it 2050?
Mhm.
Target for net zero across the EU 2050. So why did it then come out with this policy saying let's get local places to do it by 2030, but we're not giving them any money? I don't understand their motivation.
Well,
there
their
in that case.
motivation's also interesting, and that would be yet another project to see how this works the other way around. I mean, credit where credit is due. They know what they're doing, in that to that extent that they push this 2030 agenda to have actually 100 local cases that all do different things and show how climate neutrality can be done.
Okay.
So it wasn't
Okay.
as simple and as silly as it sounds to start with.
No.
What they wanted to do is they wanted to have these sort of innovation incubators. I mean, this is where this whole mission approach comes from. That comes from what's her name? She's a professor at UCL, actually, an Italian lady, Mazzucato. Is that possible? Well, will come to me. Who invented this mission idea? Who said, well, the state needs to do the basic investment and start basic research, but then it needs to be adopted by business and by local. So that makes sense. And in the end, I mean, I don't know whether the EU didn't actually reach achieve their goals here, because what they wanted to do is want the city to think about what they need to do and develop strategies.
Yeah.
And in the end,
Yeah.
although this city hasn't subscribed to that program, they have done exactly that. They have developed a local strategy. So it would be interesting actually to talk to policymakers whether they realize that. I would guess that there is a bit of realization on that, because that was the idea, right? The idea was to develop local competency and to support that, and they've got there in the end with slight sort of in a slight roundabout way.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I guess from the EU point of view, the fact that this wasn't incorporated in the scheme that they set up, they might lose the knowledge that's been gained in Halle, because they're not going to get the feedback, I guess, from the things that the local energy and the local council, the city council have done. So okay, but I get
But at
that
least
thing,
the activities are happening, and and the I mean, and that was the interesting bit, right? This sort of systemic disturbance that happened with that, and that people actually started talking about it and got quite upset about it. And this NGO that got involved, I mean, that was another interesting outcome actually of the article, of the research, was the power imbalances within these local discourses as well. So the NGO that pushed for this, they still haven't reached it. I've checked it yesterday. They still haven't got the funding to do this local climate council that they wanted to do, that they were promised. And the city hasn't got any money from this. So from their perspective, it would have been interesting. So actually the voices of local people are not as involved. The voices of local bigger businesses, I'd say, are involved through this organization that the energy provider founded and started, this network of businesses that work for net zero. So they are heard, and their concern of 2030 is not achievable. But what this means for local people who will have to live with whatever is happening, that representation is not quite happening. Because again, something that needs to be funded externally, they have to get funding. So there's yet another structural hurdle in there, right? And as far as I can see, they haven't got the money yet.
Yeah.
And that's 3 years ago.
Yeah. Let's kind of concentrate a little bit more on the methods and the kind of discourse analysis. Funny, I mean, I know all of what we've been talking about is part of how you're understanding what you've seen, and that's partly through the discourse and the scales and so on. But when you had some texts that you analysed. If you could tell us a bit about what they were, what you did to analyse them, and if this I've got the article in front of me, so we can have a look at some examples.
Can I just jump in there before Mikhail does this one by picking up on something he said earlier, which I think is useful for all researchers out there and the sort of general anti-positivist vibe we're getting from this meeting. I love the point, and this so often happens in research. In your PhD, you have to say why you selected a particular data set and why that's perfect for your research questions. As Michael has quite freely admitted, this is not what happens or happened. He had access to a certain data set, and because he had access to that data set, his research project grew around that. And I just find that so interesting. This is so often what happens to us, especially in qualitative research, that we work with what we've got and it has unintended consequences and takes us in new areas in much the same way the EU document did there. So I think, but go on and describe your data sets, but I just thought I'd pick up on that comment that you didn't choose them. That was just what you were given and that you had to run with, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I got to it with a different question, and then the questions change, and this is exactly what I always tell my PhD students as well. And research questions are a moving measuring stick, right? Because you don't know what to find. So what we had is, I had these videos, I transcribed, well, I have them auto-transcribed, I corrected them, I read through them a couple of times. I had the EU text, I had all versions of the council motions. That is very interesting, actually, nowadays, that we have access to all of that, also to the editing of that. So I could see how the motion changed from the first motion to the last motion. And I think I gave some quotes of that in the article. But I also decided I want to do some, it's not proper ethnography, not yet. It would have been if I got the funding and if I could do the work that I would actually wanted to do. But I did some interviews with actors who were involved in the debate. And I did them quite openly. So I openly, as in I didn't ask fixed question, oh, what do you mean by that? What did you do by that? I went in and said, well, actually, how does language play in these debates about climate change? Can we think about this example that I have here that you debated half a year ago? And so we got into long conversations about what they produce and who they consulted with and how they rewritten things. So that's yet another source of information. And then it's a very much bottom-up process. So I read through this. I looked at the things that I found that stuck out to me. And one of the things that stuck out to me was exactly this, that they were constantly talking about who should do this and why we shouldn't do this, or why we should do this change locally. And that's where it started, and I took notes on this. And then you think, well, this is interesting. So I need to look for this a bit more systematically. I need to map out, who are they talking about? Who are they ascribing responsibility to? What timeframes are they linking to it? What arguments are they making? Which metaphors are linked to that? So it's very much a bottom-up process. I didn't come with a fixed methodology saying, I'm looking for X. Yeah. And then I fed in. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, so in terms of the kind of data set, if we use those kinds of terms, the documents that you looked at, they are where you're getting the difference in scales. You see, you've got your original 100 climate neutral and smart cities 2030 info kit for cities is the first one. That's a European Commission level document, and that's the kind of the Kickstarter for this.
Yeah.
And then you've got these local, city level. So you've got the motions, which is the entire city council. You've got the debate, which is the council plenary. So you've got the entire city council of Halle on this city scale. And then you've got into even smaller kind of scales within the council. You've got into you've got one on the finance committee, and you've got the brochure that comes out of the Energie Initiative Halle. Is that right?
That's the Energie Initiative. That's exactly that group.
Yeah. Okay. And then you've got, and so those are the kind of real world texts that you're looking at, and that's what allows you to talk about what happens when policies cross scales or get translated through scales. Yeah.
How are they linked, and what is picked up from the wording? What intended meaning is ascribed to it? But then also the interviews are very interesting, because I saw this brochure and I thought, well, when you look at this, you look at the genre and you think, oh yeah, this is advertising, right? They are talking about themselves. And then you speak to people and they say, no, I wrote that we produced this for a completely different reason. What we tried to do here is getting people rally around and do this work on CO2 accounting and talking to us what we need to do locally. That's where this Roadmap 2045 brochure came from. And then only through the sort of ethnographic work, i.e. talking to people, observing people, I figured out there's not just this brochure, there's a whole methodology behind this that they developed under that label and that guided conversation. So it's quite a sort of free floating type of analysis. You can't do this the same way as if you have a fixed press corpus where you can look for fixed expressions. It's trying to link up the different meaning streams and construct this. And then you basically have the other typical thing that happens in I find qualitative research. You have this swinging pendulum between you read theory, you read about things, and you look at your data, and then you suddenly realize, what I'm seeing there is what's happening there. So I had this idea of textual trajectories. That's where it came from originally. So saying, well, somehow this policy must travel down, and that was the easy idea, right? I had this sort of linear thing, and then I realized more and more, this is more complicated. There are actually other actors involved. How do I describe this? And then at some point in my reading, stumbled across the whole idea about scales. I mean, I knew this from Blommet, from sociolinguistics, actually, but I didn't know it was in the same way really useful for discourse analysis until I worked with it and read around.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to sort of round that off, you say in the article that you undertook a close reading of that corpus of texts, analysing and annotating all mentions of time spaces, which makes sense. All deictics, which I'll ask you to just kind of say, what does that mean? And then actors, as well as the core political concepts in the debate, such as net zero and city climate contract. And you did that in NVivo. But so I'm just trying to get a picture practically for people who are kind of maybe just setting off doing CDA type or discourse analytical type pieces of research. You've got these documents into NVivo, which is a piece of software that you can use to help you annotate things. You can do other things as well, but that's what it is. But you kind of, I won't say any more about NVivo.
Well, but the nice thing about that piece of software. So when I did my PhD, I did this all on paper, right? And you have constant different color codings and pieces of paper clipped everywhere, and the office was an absolute mess. If you do this in a software, it's really useful because you mark things out, you give them a name, you give them a category, and then you can actually recall that category, and you get all instances of, mentioning of the EU, mentioning of city council, mentioning of energy, mentioning of things like personal pronouns, there and then, and as all the deictics, and you can see how they link together. And that's the useful thing. And you can do this across different types of text, which is also better than using a corpus software where you just pull a word that's spelled in a certain way. If you do this manually, you also find it in transcriptions where it's sometimes not as straightforward because the transcription software is not as good as it should be.
Yeah. No, it's useful. In effect, it's an electronic version of highlighting and putting notes in the margin on a piece of paper, but it can do more because you can find things more easily when you finish doing that. Let me just go back to what you said about deictics. So you mentioned a couple of examples of what that is. Just what we mean by that, because I don't think we've ever talked about this in this podcast series. I don't think we have, it sort of means that you're setting up, you've got little phrases and words that set up a kind of relation between different things. So
between times and spaces and locations.
So it could be something as small as saying, well, I did X and then I did Y, and that one word then kind of puts a relation of time between those two events that you described, X and Y. One, it makes it sequential. That was first, and this one came second. That sort of thing.
Yeah. And it
you
depends.
can see very well how.
And it depends from the time that you read it.
Yeah.
You construct what you mean by it's over there depends on where I am and where you are, left and right. So deictics are always sort of from a certain perspective within the discourse.
Exactly. But you can see you can see really well how those small settings ups of relations between time and space is really important here when you're debating and adapting and trying to respond to policies that come from some other place. There's a kind of construction of where you are as a policy-making entity, Halle or the energy company, versus them, the EU, over there, up there, wherever they are. Who've kind of come up with this. Yes, I'm good.
And also the different mentions of time and to when do we need to do this? Is this long? Is this short? Is this true? Is this actually the wrong time? There were loads of things like that in there. And then you try and make sense of why is that happening, and try and make sense of, and you group them, basically. That's what happens.
Yeah.
So think about, who's saying this? This is the other nice thing that you can do in a software like in Vivo. You have the phenomenon, so you mark everything that comes to a category of time or space or deictics. But then you can also mark the same thing of, this has been said by a left-wing councillor, this has been said by a right-wing councillor, this has been said by this party. And that so it produces the table for you, and then you see, hang on a minute. So typically, it was the people who were against this motion of 2030 local council net zero who were saying, this can't be done. We can't do this. We have no influence. Someone else needs to do this. Can only be done at that level. And then you have the proponent, which you say, no. We as a local community have to live with the consequences, and therefore also have to have an effect on this. And there are things that we can do. So you see these connections once you mark this all out. So it's a very bottom-up process. You mark this all out. You try and make connections. Try and make tables, and half of the tables that you make will never make it into publication because they're not relevant to what you do. So half of the markings, more than half, 80% of the markings that I did in these texts were not relevant in the end.
You'll go back to them when you're retired and write new articles based on them.
You look at the smile. You can see the smile on his face when you say
I think just to put a reference to a collaborator of the three of us, Jane Mulderick. I think I remember she did a talk when I was at Cardiff, and she's written on Deixis, and I think she taught the Deictic Centre is a useful concept. I mean, the Deictic Centre is me here and now, and we always are, or possibly we here and now, and the first person we orientate to that. But it's also, I can't remember the term she used, but she writes about who is invited into this Deictic Centre, who is brought close to this Deictic Centre, and who is kept away. So when when you've got the Deixis in your documents, your texts, and you're looking to see who's constructed close to the Deictic Centre and who's constructed far from the Deictic Centre, is an interesting one. Comes in terms of creating distinct groups, abnegating responsibility, making community responsibility, all things you've touched on. Just to make, to a linguistic feature, because we are linguists, the Deixis is a really interesting one, and it is one, as you say, Michael, we haven't touched on before. Maybe we'll have to get Jane in talking about Deixis at some future event.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Paul Chilton has done a lot on this as well, with sort of that he draws real graphs in international politics on who are we talking about and how far away are they space-wise and time-wise, and how can we change that. He's analyzed speeches that way. It's really useful to sort of see how do we.
I've got an example here. You've got on page 9 of your article, you've got the risks from fixing the targets in a treaty with the EU are currently unpredictable, and it's there's even that kind of relationship there. Is an interesting one to think about. But well, this is. Do we want to talk more about any other findings, these kind of linguistic findings? So we've got some Deixis. You talked about the contract earlier. That was particularly important, that use of the word contract on the part of the EU, and that being a particular sticking point. So you can see how the discourse comes in there. But did you want to say something more about that, or anything else from your analysis that you kind of found particularly striking?
What I found, another bit I found interesting, and it's both linked to the results and the process of writing this, is I submitted this and I got the reviews back, as you do. And the reviewer said, you haven't read the Ian Schmidt's work on institutional discourse. I know, I haven't. It's true. Let's have a look. And one of the things that actually put a theoretical lens on it that I didn't see before. So she's doing the same thing that I was thinking about when writing this article. I'm trying to get my head around the difference between policy discourse and political discourse and the linkages between the two. So one ideally is policy making. Someone is trying to solve a problem, and they write it down and they have a rule, they make a decision, and it's as easy as that. And while the political discourse side is quite often about publicly debating things, forming groups, that have certain positions on issues, opening up or closing down future options and all of that. And Vivian Schmid has similar things there. She talks about coordinating and communicating discourses, and such that coordinating is this policy making. We coordinate somehow our solutions, or we get to a solution. And on the other hand, you have this communicating, or you have the politicians who talk out there in the wild. And the trouble that came out of this research again is how closely interlinked these two are, and how this makes it complicated again. Because of course, public debating in a council chamber or in a parliament is not just about reasoning and finding the best solution, as much as we want that, and as much as Habermas always thought that would be the ideal. It's very much also about positioning your group, your party political group. So if you are not positioned, you need to be against it. Of course, they needed to be against this 2030 motion. And then they make arguments up why, and they root them in their own ideology. I mean, there was no surprise that the AfD, the far-right German party that's very strong in East Germany at the moment, was against this. They are climate deniers. And they didn't say that. They chose a different way. They chose the global scale to sort of say, well, actually, the Chinese are doing that, and the Australians, and actually they didn't say the Chinese as in plural. They used the singular. The China man is doing that, and the Australian man is doing that, and really, really weird how they sort of their idea of how international collaboration work is actually war, is battling. They are doing individually, and they're against us. And if we don't set up our shop properly, we are at risk here. So that's how this works. And so this is one of the outcomes, that as much as we ideally would like policy discourse to be this ideal of problem solving, it's not. It's always political. It's always repoliticized at every stage. And that makes it, again, more complicated, right? Because it brings in identities, it brings in positionalities.
And is this where you talk in the book, and I know it's something the three of us are involved in, you talk about, at the risk of new acronyms for linguistic fields, etc., you talk about the relatively field of critical policy discourse analysis, which the both of you, along with Jane, who we've just mentioned, and also Nicolina Montessori, have developed this sort of new field which brings together these elements that you're talking about, that you're saying previously were sort of treated in isolation. And I think you pointed to, could you just sort of say why you think this new area of CPDA is important in these things that you're talking about, and what the new field of CPDA is, in case people want to follow up on it and indeed purchase the book that we're all involved in?
I wasn't actually. I jumped on the bandwagon here. No, I didn't actually. I found this really compelling, this idea that you need to look at policy making through the lens of language and find these different methods and bring them together. And that's exactly why it is important to look at policy making with a political discourse lens, with a political language lens, because it shows you how people interact and how policy is made, and also why we quite often end up with compromises that no one is happy with, but because these different positions play in, and sometimes things get lost in translation as well. And the translation there can simply mean you block something because you have a good reason, like the energy provider did, but then in the end you miss the boat. They missed the deadline. That wasn't in their interest. That was not what they originally wanted, to miss the deadline. They just we need to look at this more carefully. We need to find a solution for this. They found a different solution. But that makes things messy, right? That it is always the political side of things. And all the methods that we have from analyzing political discourse apply to policy discourse too.
Yeah, it is absolutely. I mean, that's where we get into in the edited book, isn't it? So yeah, it's good to see those ideas developed here, as you've done in this article, Michael. Is and I think can't remember if we mentioned scales in there, but it's good to see if we did, it's good to see them developed.
It's
like
in
this,
Tom's
but
article. It's in
if we did
Tom's article, right?
Tom's article in there,
The islands article is in there,
yes,
where
that's right.
where that was actually one of the inspirations for using it here was reading
that's
that, Tom. So thanks.
Great stuff.
Yeah. Should we just very quickly finish off with? I mean, you've spoken about doing the process of doing the analysis and bringing those theories in and going back and forth and finding new things and responding to reviewers on this article. What about the actual process of writing it? I mean, it's very messy, and I'm just thinking about people who are, again, working to be an academic or coming out with a PhD or something. Might be listening to this. What's the process? How did you go about taking these ideas that then you found were even more messy than you imagined? You're taking you off in new directions, theoretically, empirically, getting the data you can get and sitting down and doing it. How do you turn that into an article? In 30
You just
seconds,
sat
please.
down and wrote it in a 3-day period, didn't you, Mikhail?
Yeah, I think it's about 2 years of giving talks on this was the starting point. So that depends on how your brain works, and I think different people have very different approaches to this. I'm someone who has to talk about things to develop ideas. So I wrote various versions of presentations and went to various people with this.
Interesting.
I also wrote 2 funding applications in the middle that had feedback from various people. So that's the starting point for me talking about this until it's clear in my head. And then you start writing it down. I do very much write down things in bullet points until I have everything, because quite often I have to move things around and think, no, hang on, this is the wrong part of it. This needs to go this way. And then I start producing the text.
You can
then
picture the whole article in your head from the bullet points before you actually sit down and start writing. Yeah.
Yes. And then I spend a few weeks of just coming back to it and writing it and rewriting it and reading. Actually, it's almost like you write the first 2 pages, you put it away, you come back to it, you spend an hour reading and editing the first 2 pages, you're back in it, and then you do the next bits until you're finished. And then comes one of the things that I find absolutely crucial. You need to give it to people to read. Thanks, Tom. And thanks, Nicolina, who's not in this podcast, but just another colleague who's involved in this idea of critical policy discourse analysis. I sent it to both of you. And that's absolutely the most helpful thing you can do, because people come back. Tom came back. I still don't get what you mean by ontological scales. Can I just have a sentence that says,
You now, Tom.
Yep, and very useful too.
Good.
And it's honestly, it's really, really helpful. And then you bring that in and you rewrite it and until you're happy with it, and then you submit it. And then it takes about, in my case, it took about good 7 months before I finally had the reviews and a couple of emails to the editor saying, have you remembered that my article is with you? And then I got the reviews, and they were actually mostly helpful. Also pointing out things that were unclear, and then pointing out this Vivian Schmidt thing where I thought, oh God, I've got 6,000 words. I need to bring yet in something else. And then I read it and I thought, actually, it's relevant. It makes a lot of sense to also contribute to that. And so you rewrite it, and then you send it, and then finally it gets accepted. That was actually quite quick. That was astonishing. Within days, I had happy with the revisions.
Really, for the revised version was approved almost immediately. Yeah.
John Richardson, who's the editor there, was very quick then. So saying, you've done this. So you write a proper letter that explains something I learned very early on from a good colleague, how you really sort of respond to every single step clearly and say, this is what I've done, this is what I've done, this is what I've done. And you send a second version that is marking out the changes that you've made. So I made it easy for the editor to look at this and say, he's responded to everything. Good, I can live with that.
Good tip for people doing their
Good
PhD
tip.
revisions as well, to respond as clearly as...
Yeah, make it easy. Editors, I can say this from my own editorial work, have very little time to look at these things. And it's incredible if you can see it on one look. Yes, done. Yes, very good. So always with a friendly response, even if the reviewers are annoying, which they sometimes are. In this case, they weren't. They were really helpful. And then you get the proofs, And you hopefully find all typos, which I didn't, which I realized yesterday when I looked at it sort of 2 months later after publication. I found that 2 or 3 typos that I missed, words that shouldn't be
Of
in
course,
there. And you think,
always, yeah,
no, why did I miss this?
Yeah.
That's life.
Yeah. That's good. Well, it always happens, doesn't it? And I'll just say at this point that if anybody would like a go at spotting those typos, I'll put a link to the article. And reading properly, all of this interesting stuff that you've produced. It's not always the case, but this is what's called an open access article, so it is available publicly. I'll put a link to that to the journal website where you can then download it free of charge for anybody who'd like to have a read of that.
Might be useful to say something about the open access thing for people who have not branded a lot, or PhD students who haven't done this before. British universities, and the same is true for German universities. I don't know any other systems that well have funding for this and have agreements with publishers. So it's really worth looking up whether you can get this without you having to pay anything, because open access means your library doesn't have to have it. Anyone can just download it. So it's much more likely that it's read and that it's cited. So it's worth looking when you've decided which journals you have. I tend to have a short list of things that could go in there. Have a look. And in this case, it was one of the deciding factors to know. Okay, so critical discourse studies is a really relevant journal for this. I wanted people who are publishing this to read it, and the university has an agreement with whatever the big publishing house behind this is. That I can do this open access. So you then need to do this. There's this fairly straightforward. They take care of it, and that's the way it works. So it's something to keep thinking of when you publish. It makes it easier for people to access the actual version. Also, if they live in a country that doesn't have access to things like that, quite often get asked, can I have a version of this? And you can send them something, but it's much easier if they can just access it.
Yeah, fantastic. Tom, should we finish there on that very positive note?
Yes.
Thank you very much for talking us through. Brilliant article, loads of stuff going on in there. Absolutely a contribution to critical policy discourse analysis, which I'll also put a link to that book in the description if people are interested in reading a bit more about that approach. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it.
Yes.
I certainly did. I did.
And I just think how, as we were doing this, how interesting I found it, how having Mikhail's talk about this from a very different scale, if you like, a different way of talking, complements the article really nicely. And having, the article itself, but also having Mikhail here to talk about it just really increases the understanding of the article and everything as well. It's been a really fascinating experience. I've really enjoyed it.
Yes, thanks for having me. It's also nice to be able to talk about it and make the links between this and your work. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. So we'll be back next month with another episode.
See you then.